If you've ever stood in a crowded airport, heard the clatter of suitcases on the cold pavement, and smelled the mingled aromas of hastily brewed coffee and the metallic scent of jet fuel, then you'll understand. Airports are more than just places where people depart. They are places where status, prejudice, and petty power dynamics clash every day. And there are moments when a seemingly small act can change the lives of many people. This is how the story begins. But before we delve deeper, if you believe that dignity is more important than uniforms, if you've ever been judged solely on your appearance, and if you want to hear a story that speaks not only of justice but also of silence, responsibility, and second chances, please give this video a like, share it with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Now, let's go back to that morning. Hartsfield, Jackson Atlanta International Airport, 6:40 a.m. Friday in early December. Outside, the temperature was 41 degrees Fahrenheit, and a frigid wind blew along the miles-long runway, rendering thin jackets useless. Inside the International Terminal Concourse F, everything is in constant motion. Electronic display boards flash, departure times, loudspeakers announce flight names in a monotonous voice, and people rush as if everyone is afraid of being left behind. At Gate F12, an Aurelius Air luxury international flight is preparing to take off for London. This wasn't a normal flight. This is the flagship flight, a gathering place for business people, politicians, and passengers accustomed to being served without having to ask. Standing at the gate to board the plane was Margaret Whitmore. She is 54 years old. She has worked as a flight attendant for 23 years and held the position of senior lead flight attendant for 15 years. Her uniform was always impeccably neat. Her blonde hair was combed and held in place with gel. On her chest, she wore the silver Aurelius Air badge as a medal of honor. For Margaret Gate, F12 was more than just a workplace. It was her territory. She believed she wasn't just checking tickets. She believed she was upholding standards. Boarding for first class and platinum members only, Margaret said through the microphone, her voice sweet but cold, loud enough for those standing nearby to hear clearly. The crowd began to move forward. Expensive suit, polished leather shoes, a gaze accustomed to being treated with special treatment. Margaret nodded at a few familiar faces. An investment fund manager from New York, a lawyer from Chicago, an elderly couple on an anniversary vacation. Then she saw her. The girl stood slightly apart from the crowd, quiet, unhurried, dark-skinned, around 30 years old, wearing a dark gray hoodie, simple jeans, and worn-out sneakers. She carried a canvas tote bag on her shoulder. No logo, no brand. She stood upright, her gaze calmly, observing the boarding gate as if she were accustomed to waiting. Margaret felt a familiar sensation rising in her chest. Not anger, but discomfort. No one said it out loud, but over the years Margaret believed she could identify who belonged here and who didn't. The girl walked onto the red carpet of the first-class lane. Margaret stepped out first without asking for a ticket. She just raised her hand. "Economy boarding is later," Margaret said, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You'll need to wait." The girl stopped. Slowly she looked up. Her eyes held neither panic nor defiance. "It's just surprisingly calm, I know," she said. Her voice was low, clear, and unhurried. "But my seat is 1A. Gate F12 in that moment seemed to slow down." Margaret chuckled softly, a brief laugh, sharp and full of skepticism. Seat 1A. The most exclusive seat. The most expensive. And according to Margaret, not for people wearing hoodies. She held out her hand. "Let me see your ticket." The girl took the ticket from her jacket pocket. That was a moment nobody at Gate F12 knew would happen. In just a few minutes, this entire flight will be detained, and a much bigger truth will be revealed. Naomi Carter held up the ticket and gently placed it in Margaret Whitmore's palm. No rush, no nervousness, no gestures that resembled asking for permission or pleading. It's just a very normal thing to do, like someone who's flown enough to understand that arguing at the airport rarely gets you anywhere. Margaret took the ticket. The moment her fingers touched the thick paper, she paused for a very brief moment. No one noticed. But she did. The boarding pass is different from a regular ticket. The paper is thicker. The printing is sharper. It has markings indicating a special check-in area. Margaret lowered her eyes to read. Naomi Carter. Flight AA 718, Seat 1A, status VVIP. She squinted. VIP. Margaret has seen VIPs. She has seen platinums. She has seen diamonds. But VVIPs are not numerous. They are very rare. A fleeting moment of confusion passed through her so quickly that Margaret herself didn't want to admit it. She looked up. Her eyes scanned Naomi from head to toe. The gray hoodie, the worn shoes, the unbranded canvas bag. Then she looked down at the ticket again. In Margaret's mind, those two images didn't match. And when people believe that the world must operate according to familiar patterns, anything that deviates from those patterns is considered wrong. Where did you get this, Margaret Hoy? Her voice had changed. It was no longer sweet, no longer falsely polite. Naomi maintained a calm expression. At the check-in counter, she replied, "This morning." Margaret chuckled softly. "Ma'am Banoy, this type of boarding pass is restricted. It's not issued to just anyone." The way she punctuated her sentences was very skillful. It wasn't directly offensive, but it was enough for the listener to understand. Naomi took a small breath. It wasn't because I was angry. It was because I was tired. She had heard this kind of tone for the first 20 years of her life. From the mall security guard, from the hotel receptionist, from people who believed that small power gave them the right to judge others. "I'm not just anyone," Naomi said, her voice even. "I'm a passenger on this flight." Margaret tilted her head. "Then you won't mind if I verify this Banoy?" She gestured to Evan Brooks, a young flight attendant standing nearby. Evan is just over 20 years old. This is his first year working for Aurelius Air. He stepped forward, glanced quickly at Naomi, then at Margaret. There was something in Naomi's eyes that made Evan uncomfortable. Not fear, but respect. "Should I scan it?" Evan asked softly. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She looked at Naomi one more time, then said, "No, I don't want a system error delaying boarding." Evan swallowed hard. "Ma'am, Annoy K, if it's valid, it'll scan green." Margaret K sang. Her eyes narrowed. "I said no, Banoy. Let's not embarrass ourselves." Embarrass. It hung there between them heavier than the loudspeaker announcement. Naomi looked at Evan. Her gaze wasn't reproachful. Just a brief glance enough for Evan to understand that she knew he was afraid. "I'm not afraid of her. I'm afraid of Margaret. I'm afraid of the system. I'm afraid of being in the wrong place. Ma'am, Naomi Noi Kwelai Margaret. If there's an issue, please reprint the ticket. I'm happy to wait." That statement could have been the way out, a dignified retreat, an opportunity for Margaret to pause. But Margaret Whitmore had been in this profession for too long to accept the possibility of being wrong in front of others. She felt the eyes behind her beginning to turn. First-class passengers didn't like waiting. They didn't like ambiguity. A middle-aged man in a dark blue suit sighed. "Is there a problem?" he asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. Margaret smiled at him, a smile reserved for the right person. "Just a small verification issue, Banoy. We'll be right with you." Then turned back to Naomi. "Step aside, please, Margaret Noy. You're holding up the line." Naomi didn't move. It wasn't because of a challenge. It was because she understood if she stepped aside, everything would end there. No one apologized. No one took responsibility. And tomorrow, someone else just like her will be standing in this position. "I'm not holding up the line, Naomi Noy. I'm standing where my ticket says I belong." The area in front of gate F12 became uncomfortably silent. Margaret felt the blood rush to her face. She bent down, looking at the ticket in her hand as if it were proof of a crime. "This is fake," she said. "Or stolen." Evan was startled. "Margaret," he began. Margaret raised her hand. "I've seen this before, Ba Tiep Tuk. People printing upgraded passes, trying to walk into places they don't belong." The word belong fell very heavily. Naomi felt her chest tighten. It's not because of the pain. It's because of the memories. Her early days at private school. Board meetings where she was the only black woman in the room. The times she had to prove she deserved the seat that had been legally awarded to her. She took a deep breath. "Scan it," Naomi said. Her voice was deeper, more certain. "It'll turn green." Margaret looked at her. At that moment, Margaret didn't see a single passenger. She saw a challenge. A threat to the control she had been accustomed to holding for years. "No," Margaret said, each word falling distinctly. "I won't." Then she did something that left Evan speechless, made several passengers gasp, and made Naomi understand that the first door has closed. Margaret folded the ticket. Once. "Then tear it up." The sound of tearing paper echoed clearly in the otherwise noisy space. Tear it again. And then, again. She crumpled the pieces of paper into balls, turned around, and threw them straight into the trash can behind the counter. "You are denied boarding," Margaret said, her voice firm. "Please leave the area." Naomi stood still. Nobody said anything. Evan felt his heart pounding. He looked at Naomi. He wanted to say something, anything, but his throat was dry and stiff. Naomi bent down to look at the trash can. Then she looked up. There were no tears. There was no shouting. Just one sentence very softly. "You really shouldn't have done that." Margaret laughed contemptuously. "Next," she said into the microphone. But Naomi didn't move. And somewhere deep within this vast airport spanning miles, a chain of events has just begun. Naomi Carter remained standing still in front of gate F-12. It wasn't the kind of stiff, shock-inducing stance. Rather, it was the stance of someone in control of themselves. Around her, the first-class crowd began to move again. Suitcases rolled past their wheels, clattering. A few quick glances turned away, as if afraid of being drawn into an awkward situation. Margaret Whitmore turned her back. In her mind, it was over. A disruptive passenger had been removed. Order had been restored. That's how Margaret always saw the world. Everything either belonged in its proper place or had to be pushed out. But Naomi hasn't left yet. She bent down and picked up a small piece of ticket that had fallen out of the trash can. It was just a corner of paper with part of the barcode still faintly printed on it. She looked at it for a few seconds. "It's not because I regret spending the money. It's not because I'm angry." Because she was deep in thought. Naomi had been through too many similar situations in her life to understand that the first reaction is often not the best one. She had stood in rooms where people talked as if she didn't exist. She had been asked, "Are you sure you're in the right meeting?" She had had to smile, swallow her anger, and choose the right moment to speak. This airport is just a different version, noisier, more public, but the essence remains the same. "Ma'am." "Evan Brooks." Voice rang out from behind. Naomi returned. Evan stood there, his hands clasped together. He looked younger than his actual age at that moment. His eyes were anxious, but he didn't flinch. "I'm sorry, en Neuker. I shouldn't have let it get that far." Naomi looked at him. She didn't answer immediately. Evan continued, his voice lowering. "I can get security if you want. Or I can try to talk to her." Naomi shook her head. "No," she said. "Don't do that." Evan was surprised. "Why not?" he asked. Naomi smiled faintly. It wasn't a happy smile, but it wasn't bitter either. "Because you'll pay for it later, Konoi. And I don't want that on you." Evan froze. He had never heard a passenger speak like that. He had never seen anyone in this situation think about the consequences for others. But she was wrong, Anoi. "You know that." Naomi nodded. "Yes," she replied. She was. Then she added slowly, "But sometimes being right isn't the same as being strategic." Evan didn't fully understand, but he sensed that this wasn't an ordinary woman. Meanwhile, Margaret Whitmore walked toward the dispatch counter and spoke with another gate employee. "Call airport security ba Noi. She's refusing to leave." The employee hesitated. "Are you sure, Kotahoy? There's no yelling, no disturbance." Margaret Quay sang. "Refusal to comply is enough, ba Noi. Protocol." The term was then used again. Protocol. Margaret fell in love with it. It helped her believe that all her decisions had a reason, even if that reason was just a subjective feeling. Naomi heard it. She didn't turn around. She just stood there, holding the small ticket in her hand. She took her phone out of her pocket. A black phone, no case, no sparkle. She looked at the screen for a moment. In her contact list, there were so many names that a single phone call could have ended this immediately. Her father, corporate lawyer, CEO of Aurelius Air. But Naomi didn't dial. She locked the screen. She needed certainty, not for herself, but for something bigger. "Ma'am," a male voice called out. "Is there a problem here?" That's Richard Hale, the airport's shift manager. He was in his 50s. His voice was deep. His face showed the weariness of someone who had dealt with too many problems. Margaret turned back immediately. "Yes, Banoin Han." She presented a fraudulent boarding pass and is now refusing to leave the boarding area. Richard looked at Naomi. Then he looked at Margaret. "Is that so?" he asked. Naomi lifted her head. "Sir Ko Noi, my boarding pass was destroyed. I asked for it to be scanned or reprinted. That request was denied." Richard frowned. "Destroyed," he repeated. Margaret folded her arms. It was fake Banoi. I disposed of it. Richard Quay, sang Evan. Did you see that? He asked. Evan swallowed. Yes, he said. I did. A moment of silence fell. Not long, but heavy enough. Richard exhaled. Ma'am, he said to Naomi, do you have any proof of purchase? Naomi opened her bag and took out a thin envelope. Inside was a printed electronic receipt along with a confirmation email. Richard reads quickly. His expression changed. Seat 1A, he said. VVIP. He looked up and gazed at Margaret. Why wasn't this scanned? He asked. Margaret felt a drop of sweat trickle down her back. The system's been unstable, Banoi. I didn't want to slow down boarding, Richard Noitiep. I get it. He paused for a moment. But destroying a boarding pass isn't protocol. Margaret opened her mouth. Then close it again. For the first time in years, she felt the ground beneath her feet was no longer firm. Naomi stood there saying nothing more. She understood very well this was just the turning point. If she pushes harder now, things will explode immediately, quickly, violently. But she didn't want to explode. She wanted the truth to make its own way. Sir Naomi, Noi Voy Richard. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the same treatment any passenger with a valid ticket deserves. Richard looked at her for a long time, then he nodded. Please wait here, Ong Noi. I need to make a call. As Richard turned away, Margaret felt her heart race. Margaret Evan the thumb. Maybe we should just stay out of it, Margaret interrupted. Her voice was no longer as firm as before. Naomi watched Richard go. She knew that call wouldn't be simple. And somewhere in a quiet office hundreds of miles from this airport a name is about to be mentioned. A name Margaret Whitmore had seen in internal emails, but had never read carefully. Richard Hale left gate F12 and walked quickly toward the coordination office at the end of the glass corridor. The door closed behind him, leaving an uncomfortable silence. At the boarding gate, everything seemed to be held in a state of waiting. No one spoke loudly. No one laughed. The first-class passengers began checking their watches more frequently. For them, time is something that shouldn't be wasted. Margaret Whitmore stood with her back straight and her arms crossed in front of her chest. She maintained her composure, but only she knew her heart rate was accelerating. Margaret hated this feeling, a feeling of uncertainty, the feeling when things no longer operate in their familiar, orderly manner. She glanced at Naomi Carter. The girl remained standing there, her back straight, her shoulders relaxed. Don't cross your arms. Don't look at your phone. Don't show impatience. Just stand. That calmness irritated Margaret more than any resistance. In Margaret's mind, one question kept repeating. Why wasn't she afraid? Most of the people she stopped were scared. They apologized. They explained. They tried to prove they were worthy. But Naomi didn't. Margaret Quay sang Evan Brooks. Go help with boarding, she said, her voice low but sharp. Evan hesitated. But I said go, Margaret, Cotton Gang. Evan turned away, but before leaving, he glanced at Naomi one last time. That look spoke louder than an apology. Naomi understood, and she nodded very slightly. It was a small gesture, but Evan felt a sense of calm in his chest. In the background, an elderly woman in a pale blue dress whispered to her husband, "Why is she still standing there?" The husband shrugged, probably trying to get an upgrade on Noi. People do that. Naomi heard it. She didn't come back. But those words touched a very deep part of her. It's not because it's new. It's because it's too familiar. Naomi recalls the first time she stepped into Carter Global Logistics headquarters 15 years ago. She was just a middle manager at the time. She walked into the meeting room and someone asked her, "Can you get us some coffee?" No one apologizes when they realize they were wrong. They just laughed as if it were a minor, insignificant mistake. Such small mistakes, repeated over and over again, can wear down anyone. But Naomi learned one thing much earlier than many others. Prejudice rarely shouts. It whispers. And it makes decisions in silence. Margaret went back to the counter and picked up the walkie-talkie. "Security, ETA?" she asked. 5 minutes, the voice replied. "Traffic inside the terminal." Margaret exhaled. 5 minutes. In those 5 minutes, everything can change. Or it's locked securely. Naomi looked at the clock on the wall. 6:58 a.m. The airplane door was still open. The flight hadn't closed yet. She knew that technically everything could still be resolved smoothly. But she also knew something else. Margaret Whitmore wasn't the type to back down once she'd gone too far. "Ma'am." The voice of Janice Miller, another older flight attendant, rang out from behind Margaret. Janice had worked with Margaret for over 10 years. She understood Margaret. She understood her very well. "Maybe we should let Richard handle it, Janice Noy. Boarding is getting delayed," Margaret Quay sang. Her eyes narrowed. "This is my gate, Ba Noy, and I'm handling it." Janice remained silent. She looked at Naomi, then at Margaret. In Janice's eyes there was a hint of regret. She had seen Margaret behave like this before. Not often, but enough to know this wasn't the first time. But Janice never said anything. Like most people in this industry, she learned to bow her head. Naomi sensed those gazes. People who knew something was wrong but weren't safe enough to speak up. She doesn't blame them. The system is built to protect those at the top, not those who speak the truth. "Ma'am, Margaret Quay, Naomi. Security is on the way. You'll need to leave the boarding area now." Naomi looked at her. This time her expression changed slightly. No anger. No challenge. Rather, it's pity. "I'm not going anywhere, Naomi Noy, until this is documented." Margaret gave a cold laugh. "Documented ba nyaklai." "You think this is court?" Naomi responded very slowly. "No," she said, "but it's accountability." That made Margaret stop in her tracks. Accountability. One word, Margaret disliked it, demanded self-reflection. At the end of the corridor, Richard Hale turned around. He walked faster, his expression more serious than before. Margaret looked at him, her heart pounding. "Richard Banoy Truk, I've already called security. She's refusing to Margaret Richard Katloy. We need to talk." His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm enough. He gestured for her to step aside. Margaret reluctantly complied. Naomi stood still, but her ears perked up. Richard lowered his voice. "I just spoke with Corporate Ongnoy. There's a flag on this passenger." Margaret squinted. "A flag?" she asked. For what? Richard looked directly at her. For executive oversight. Margaret felt her throat dry up. "That doesn't mean she began. It means Richard Noy Chum Rai, this isn't something we handle at gate level." Margaret shook her head. "You're overreacting, Banoy." She doesn't look like Richard raised his hand. "Stop," he said. "Just stop." Some passengers started to notice. No one could hear the content clearly, but they clearly saw the change in their posture. Margaret is no longer the sole controller. Naomi saw the scene and she wasn't happy. Just exhale very gently. She knew that from this moment on things would never be the same again. And somewhere in a high-rise office, an old email that Margaret Whitmore once glanced at without reading was quietly resurfacing. Collecting debts. The atmosphere in front of Gate F-12 became incredibly tense. No one said it out loud, but everyone sensed that something was deviating from its familiar course. Margaret Whitmore stood there, her hands clasped tightly together, her nude-colored fingernails digging into her skin until they turned white. She wasn't used to this feeling. "I'm not used to a small situation getting out of control." In her more than 20 years working for Aurelius Air, Margaret dealt with all kinds of passengers. Drunkards, aggressive people, people who thought their money gave them the right to insult others. She always wins, not through brute force but through the system behind it, a system of rules, of hierarchy, of the idea that I know what I'm doing. But this time, something was wrong. Richard Hale stood opposite Margaret, keeping a distance close enough not to embarrass her in front of the crowd, but close enough for her to understand he was serious. "Margaret," Richard said, his voice lowering. "This needs to pause. We escalate this to corporate." Margaret shook her head. "No," she replied immediately. "We don't halt boarding over one questionable passenger." Naomi Carter heard every word clearly. She didn't interrupt. She didn't cut in. She didn't justify herself. She stood there, a silent witness to how the system exposed itself. Richard looked at Naomi, then turned back to Margaret. "This isn't about the passenger anymore, Ongnoy. It's about procedure." Margaret laughed. "Procedure," she said, her voice louder than usual. "I am the procedure here." A few passengers started turning around to look. A young man picked up his phone, pretending to text but actually recording a video. Margaret didn't notice. Or perhaps she did notice but was no longer lucid enough to pay attention. Naomi watched the scene and a very familiar feeling welled up in her chest. She had seen this moment before. In boardrooms. In court hearings. In situations where someone felt their authority was being challenged. In such situations, people don't usually retreat. They accelerate. Security is almost here, Margaret said, as if to reassure herself. She'll be removed and this flight will depart. Naomi looked at Margaret. For the first time, she spoke out directly. Margaret, Naomi said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. Margaret spun around. How do you know my name, Bahoy? Naomi didn't answer immediately. She simply said, You still have time to stop. That statement left Margaret speechless for half a second. Just half a second. But in that half second, a door opened. A door to retreat, to correct mistakes, to choose a different outcome. Margaret did not step over. She felt insulted, under threat. I've been seen through. Don't patronize me, Margaret Gatlen. You don't belong here, and you know it. The space fell silent. This time, the silence was no longer neutral. It's heavy. It has weight. Naomi felt her heart tighten, not because of fear, but because of sadness. She said it. No ambiguity, no concealment. You don't belong here. Naomi recalled an evening from a long time ago. She was in her early 20s, standing in front of a fancy restaurant in Manhattan. The waiter looked at her, then at the reservation list. Are you sure you're in the right place, Ong Tahoy? She turned away. Don't make a fuss. Don't complain. She chose the longer, more difficult path. And now, standing before gate F12, Naomi understood that she couldn't turn away again. Not for herself, but for everyone who has ever been said that. Margaret Richard said, his voice now sterner. That's enough. Margaret didn't listen, or they simply don't want to listen. She turned towards the counter, picked up the walkie-talkie. Security Banoi. I need you here now. Non-compliant passenger. Naomi closed her eyes for a second. Not to avoid the issue, but to make a decision. She opened her phone. Not the contact list. Its email. She quickly typed a short line. No lengthy explanations. No blame. Just the facts recorded at the right time. When she pressed send, something very light slipped from her shoulder. It was as if she had just put down a heavy burden she had carried for many years. Ma'am, Janice Miller approached Naomi. Her voice was soft but sincere. I'm sorry. Naomi looked at her. This time Naomi smiled genuinely. Thank you for saying that, Konoi. It matters. Janice choked up. She nodded, then stepped back. Footsteps echoed at the end of the hallway. 2 airport security officers approached. Margaret breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, she said, her voice softening considerably. Please escort her out. One of the 2 employees looked at Naomi. Ma'am, he said. Can you come with us? Naomi nodded. Of course, she said. She turned to Richard. Before I go, Naomi Noi, I'd like this documented. My name is Naomi Carter. Richard froze. Carter, he repeated. Naomi nodded. Yes, Konoi. As in Carter Global Logistics. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at Naomi more closely. Look at the way she stands, the way she speaks, the way she doesn't need to prove anything. Oh, he murmured softly. Margaret heard it. Carter, what she asked, her voice beginning to tremble. Richard Quay sang Margaret. Margaret, he said. We need to stop. Right now. But it was too late. Naomi followed security towards the walkway next to gate F12. It wasn't because she was forced. It was because she knew the next collision won't happen here, and when it comes it won't be noisy. It will get cold. Exactly, and irreversibly. Somewhere within Aurelius Air's internal system, an email has just been opened. And the name Margaret Whitmore began to be flagged in the red. Naomi Carter walked slowly behind 2 airport security officers. No one held her hand. No one pulled her along. But the way everyone was watching made her feel as if she were being escorted away. Gate F12 was behind her, still lit up, still noisy. Boarding continued as if nothing had happened. That's always how the system works. One individual was removed. The machine continued to run. Naomi stopped in the waiting area next to it, where glass walls separated it from the stream of passengers. Ma'am, one of the 2 security guards said, we just need you to wait here. Naomi nodded. Of course. She sat down on the cold metal chair, placing her cloth bag beside her. At this distance, she could still see gate F12 through the glass, and she saw Margaret Whitmore. Margaret was saying something to Richard Hale. Her hand gestures were faster and more hurried than before. It's no longer the appearance of someone in power. Instead, it's the appearance of someone trying to hold on to power. Richard shook his head. Then he turned away. Margaret stood there alone in front of the counter. In that moment, Naomi suddenly saw A human being, not a villain, not a symbol of prejudice. She was simply a woman who had tied her entire self-worth to a title, and now that title is in jeopardy. Naomi bent down and took out her phone. The screen displayed the message email sent. Just a short email, no drama, no emotion. But Naomi knew it would create a chain reaction that couldn't be stopped. At gate F12, Margaret Whitmore took a deep breath. She looked at her watch. 7:12 a.m. The airplane door is about to close. She couldn't let this delay the flight. She couldn't let her superiors think she wasn't in control of the situation. Margaret Quay sang. Janice Miller. "Finish boarding," she said. "I'll handle this." Janice hesitated. "Margaret, maybe. Just do your job, Margaret, Cotton Gang." Janice remained silent. She looked toward the glass area where Naomi was sitting. A feeling of unease spread through Janice's heart. She had worked in this industry long enough to know when a small matter was about to become a very big one. Margaret returned to the counter. On the table, a small piece of paper lay out of place. Margaret realized it immediately. A piece of boarding pass. Perhaps it fell out of the trash can when Naomi picked it up. Or maybe someone accidentally dropped it. Margaret stared at the piece of paper for a long time. A strange feeling crept into her chest. No regrets. Not yet. It was anger. Angry because things weren't going the way she was used to. Angry because a woman in a hoodie had made her doubt herself. Margaret picked up the piece of paper. She crumpled it up in her hand. Then, as if to reassure herself, she tore it one more time. The paper is torn. The sound is dry and sharp. Evan Brooks, who was standing not far away, heard it. He turned around. And in that moment, Evan understood something. This is no longer about a ticket. This is a story about the ego, about the fear of losing power, and about a person who has gone too far to turn back. Margaret Evans said, his voice trembling. "Please, stop." Margaret spun around. "Get back to your station, Baquat, or you'll be written up." Evan stood still. For the first time in his short career, he didn't step back. "No," he said. "This isn't right." Margaret looked at him, unable to believe her ears. "You think you know better than me, Bahoy?" Evan took a deep breath. "I think we're wrong and noi, and I don't want to be part of it." The air around us seemed to freeze. Margaret laughed loudly. A sharp, echoing laugh resounded through the gate area. "You'll regret this," she said. Evan didn't answer. He turned away, his heart pounding. On the other side of the glass, Naomi saw it all. She didn't intervene. She didn't signal. But deep inside her, something very important had been stirred. Hope. It's not because the system will correct the mistakes. It's because humans can. Suddenly, the large screen above gate F12 flickered. Flight information has disappeared. Instead, only a line of red text remained. "Flight hold. Do not board." A faint alarm sounded. Not big, but big enough to make people stop. Janice spun around to look. "Margaret," she whispered. "What did you do?" Margaret felt her heart sink. "Impossible, ba lom bum. We didn't request a hold." Richard Hale ran back. His face turned pale. "Margaret," he said, his voice tense. "The flight has been put on hold." Margaret turned to him. "By whom?" she asked. Richard swallowed hard. "By corporate," he said. "Executive override." Margaret felt her head spinning. Executive override. A term rarely used. Only when something very serious happens. The passengers began to murmur. "What's going on? Why aren't we boarding?" "I have a connection," Janice tried to reassure them. But Margaret heard nothing more. A memory suddenly surfaced in her mind. 3 days ago. An email from Aurelius Air Corporate. Title ownership update. Please read. Margaret saw it, and she ignored it. She thought it was just a financial announcement. It had nothing to do with her daily work. Now Margaret began to understand. Richard looked directly at her. "Margaret," he said slowly, "do you know who Naomi Carter is?" Margaret opened her mouth. No sound came out. On the other side of the glass, Naomi Carter stood up. She walked towards gate F12. No rush, no stress. It's just the steps of someone who knows that. The rules of the game have just changed. Naomi Carter walked through the glass door leading back to the gate F12 area. There were no hurried footsteps. There were no stage lights. It was just the sound of shoes lightly touching the tile floor, regular and firm. But each step she took made the atmosphere in the boarding area as tense as an overstretched string. The passengers began to fall silent. No one needs to be informed that something unusual is happening. The screen above still displays the red text. Flight hold. Do not board. Margaret Whitmore stood motionless behind the counter. Her ears were ringing. Have you ever experienced this feeling before? Margaret tried to remember, but her mind was clouded with a thick fog. Naomi stopped a few feet from the counter. Not too close. Not too far. The distance is sufficient for conversation, and sufficient without being overwhelming. Richard Hale stood next to Margaret holding a walkie-talkie but said nothing. He looked at Naomi as if he were looking at a painting he had never paid close attention to before. Now he began to notice details he had previously overlooked. The way Naomi stood, the way she kept her back straight but her shoulders relaxed, the way her gaze neither avoided eye contact nor sought to intimidate. That wasn't the look of someone begging, nor was it the look of someone seeking revenge. That's the look of someone who's used to making big decisions. Miss Carter, Richard said first. His voice was lower, more cautious. Naomi nodded. Yes. Margaret was startled. For the first time since this morning, she heard Naomi's name addressed with clear respect. Richard, Margaret interjected, her voice hoarse. What's going on? Richard didn't answer immediately. He looked at Naomi as if asking for permission with his eyes. Naomi took a deep breath. She could feel her heartbeat. Steady, not fast, not erratic. She had been preparing for this moment for a long time. Not today. It was many years ago. Margaret, Naomi said. Her voice was soft, but clear. I didn't come here to delay your flight, nor did I come to prove who I am. Margaret opened her mouth. Then he closed his mouth again. Naomi continued. I came here like any other passenger, with a legitimate ticket, and I expect to be treated properly. Margaret felt her throat was dry and sore. She wanted to say that she was just following the rules, that she had no personal intentions, but when faced with Naomi's gaze, those words suddenly sounded meaningless. Naomi Quay sang Richard. Richard, she said, I believe you received the email I sent. Richard nodded. Yes, he replied. I just did. Margaret spun around. What email? She asked. Richard hesitated for a moment. Then he spoke. From Carter Global Logistics. Margaret felt as if someone had just pulled the chair out from under her feet. Carter Global, she repeated. Naomi nodded. I am the CEO, she said. And currently Carter Global is the controlling shareholder of Aurelius Air. No one spoke up. It's not because we don't understand. It's because we understand too well. A few passengers in the back started whispering. Did she just say CEO Carter Global owns Aurelius? Margaret shook her head. No, that's impossible, she whispered. I would have known. Naomi looked at her. This time, Naomi's gaze was no longer neutral. No anger, no pleasure. It's just sadness. She was notified, Naomi said. 3 days ago. Margaret recalled that email. Title, long, boring. She deleted it without opening it. In Margaret's mind, a series of images played in reverse. The times she stood at the gate. The people she stopped. The glances she ignored. Not all of them, but enough. Why didn't you say anything sooner, Margaret Hoy Gyong Vo Ra? Naomi looked at her for a long time. Because she said slowly it shouldn't matter. Margaret looked up. Naomi continued. You shouldn't treat me fairly just because I'm the CEO. You should treat me fairly because I'm a human being. The air felt thick. Richard turned away and swallowed hard. Janice Miller stood at a distance, covering her mouth with both hands. Evan Brooks stood by the boarding gate, his eyes red and swollen. Naomi Quay sang Evan. Thank you for speaking up, she said. Evan froze. Ma'am, Naomi shook her head. No, she said. You did the right thing. And doing the right thing always comes at a price. Evan felt a tightness in his chest. Margaret felt her legs trembling. She gripped the edge of the counter tightly. Miss Carter, she said, her voice almost pleading. I didn't know. Naomi nodded. I know, she replied. And that's the problem. A long silence fell. Nobody said anything. It's not because there's nothing left to say. It's because everything has already been said. Richard cleared his throat. Miss Carter Ong Noi. Corporate is on the line. They want to speak with you. Naomi nodded. Put them on speaker, she said. Richard complied. A man's voice came through the walkie-talkie. Deep, calm, familiar with authority. Naomi, the voice said. We see what's happening. Naomi closed her eyes for a second. It's not because I'm tired. It's because it's heavy. She opened her eyes. Yes, she replied. So do I. Margaret stood there, her whole body tense. For the first time in her life, she didn't know where she was standing. He's no longer the gatekeeper, nor is he necessarily the one being punished. It's simply a person facing the consequences of their own actions. Naomi turned to her. Margaret, she said, I don't want you to be humiliated, but I also can't let this go unnoticed. Margaret nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I understand, she whispered. Naomi took a deep breath. At that moment, she wasn't thinking about power, not thinking about shares, not thinking about contracts. She thought about all the people who had ever stood in that position, and none of them had ever come back to say, this is incorrect. We'll talk later, Naomi said, but not here. She turned away, not like a winner, but like someone who has just put down a very long-held burden. And behind her, Margaret Whitmore came to understand something that she probably understood too late. There are mistakes that can only be heard when people lose power. Only then will they be silent enough to hear them. The call from headquarters ended in silence. It wasn't a kind of relieved silence. It was the kind of silence that made you swallow hard. Naomi Carter returned the walkie-talkie to Richard Hale. She said nothing more, only nodded slightly. Richard looked at her, his gaze a mixture of respect and caution. Corporate will back whatever decision you make, Ong Noi. Officially. Naomi understood what that meant. She has all the power. Right now. Right here. Margaret Whitmore stood behind the counter, her hands trembling as she placed them on the countertop. She no longer looked at Naomi with the eyes of an adversary, but with the eyes of someone awaiting judgment. Around them, Gate F-12 had become a strange space. No one left. No one spoke. The passengers, accustomed to being given priority, now stood still, as if they understood they were witnessing something priceless. Naomi looked around. She saw Evan Brooks standing huddled by the boarding gate. His shoulders were tense. He was bracing himself for being called into the Human Resources office. She saw Janice Miller, her eyes red and swollen like someone who had just realized she had been silent for too long. And then, Naomi looked at Margaret. Margaret Whitmore, the woman who once controlled Gate F-12 as her own territory, now looks much smaller. Naomi took a deep breath. Not to muster up courage, but to keep my voice from sounding angry, Margaret, Naomi said. The whole area held its breath. Margaret looked up. Yes, she replied. Her voice was hoarse, tired. Naomi took another step towards the counter. Don't get too close. Don't put pressure on them. Just close enough to talk like two people. I could end your career right now, Naomi said. Her voice was even. No threat. Margaret closed her eyes. I know, she whispered. Naomi continued. I can request an immediate suspension, a full investigation, and you'll leave this place with an unsalvageable record. A few passengers took a small breath. Evan bowed his head. Janice covered her mouth with her hand. Margaret opened her eyes. Then do it, she said. Her voice cracked. I deserve it. Naomi fell silent for a second. In that moment, the image of her father flashed through her mind. A black man who once stood in front of cold, sterile rooms begging for investment. He was once told, you don't fit the image. He taught Naomi something she would never forget. You don't need to make others seem small to prove you're big. Naomi lifted her head. But I won't do that, she said. A wave of murmurs spread. Margaret looked up sharply. What she exclaimed, unable to hide her confusion. Naomi Quay sang Richard. Richard Konoi, please make sure this is documented. Richard nodded immediately. Everything is being recorded, he replied. Naomi returned to Margaret. I will not be asking for her dismissal today, Naomi said. Margaret felt dizzy. Why? She asked. Her voice was barely her own. Naomi looked at her. Not cold, not pitying, but it was a very genuine look. Because, if she leaves here right now, Naomi said, she'll take this story with her and tell it however she wants. Margaret remained silent. Naomi continued. She'll say she was ruined by an angry black CEO. She'll get sympathy from people who have never been in my position. No one objected, because that's the truth. Naomi took a step back. And she won't learn anything, she said. She'll just switch roles as the victim. Margaret felt her heart tighten. Then what do you want, Bahoy? Naomi looked out the window where the runway stretched out under the gray sky. She saw ground workers wearing reflective vests bending over in the cold wind, pushing trolleys of luggage weighing hundreds of pounds. She likes to talk about standards, Naomi said without turning around. About who belongs. She turned to Margaret. Then you'll have to start all over again, Naomi said. From a place where no one applauds, no one bows, and no one fears you. Margaret swallowed hard. Naomi Quay sang Richard. I want her reassigned Konoi. Effective immediately. Richard nodded. To where, he asked. Naomi answered without hesitation. Ground operations. A louder murmur arose. Margaret took a step back. Ground operations, she repeated. You mean ramp Naomi Noi. Loading, unloading, same hours, entry-level responsibilities. Margaret felt her legs go weak. I'm 54, she said. My back, Naomi didn't interrupt. You have a choice, Konoi. You can take the reassignment, or you can resign. Margaret felt a lump in her throat. And if I resign, bah hoy, Richard answered on his behalf. No severance, Ong Noi, and the incident will be noted as misconduct. Margaret looked around. No one could avoid her gaze. For the first time in years, she felt like she could truly see. Not as a controller, but as a person who must take responsibility. Naomi walked closer. Her voice lowered. I'm not doing this to punish her, Naomi said. I'm doing this so she understands what it feels like to be disrespected. Margaret closed her eyes. Tears welled up. I'll take the reassignment, she said. Her voice cracked. I'll take it. Naomi nodded. Good, she said. She turned to Evan. Evan, Naomi called. Evan was startled. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Naomi Noi. Your supervisor will be informed that you acted with integrity. Evan felt his eyes sting. Thank you, he said, his voice trembling. Naomi Quay sang Janice. Janice, Konoi. Next time you see something wrong, don't wait 5 years to speak. Janice nodded. Tears streamed down her face. I won't, she said. Naomi looked back at Margaret one last time. No gloating, no triumph, just a glance closing a chapter. Board the flight, Naomi said to Richard. I'm ready. The screen above, Gate F-12 changes. Boarding resumed. The loudspeaker blared. The passengers began to move. But the atmosphere had changed. Quieter, slower, and somehow more humble. Naomi stepped onto the conduit bridge. Don't look back. Behind her, Margaret Whitmore removed her badge from her coat. For the first time in over 20 years, the sky over Atlanta was a leaden gray early morning. The wind blew across the runway like a thin blade cutting into every exposed patch of skin. Margaret Whitmore stood at the entrance to the ramp area holding her brand-new employee ID badge. No more silver badges. No more crisp-pressed uniform jackets. It was just a reflective vest that was too big and thick gloves that smelled of rubber. Whitmore, Frank Delgado, the ground foreman, spoke in a curt voice. Margaret was startled. Yes, she replied. Frank looked her up and down. Ever worked ramp before, he asked. Margaret shook her head. No. Frank nodded. Then you'll learn fast, Ong Noi, or you'll quit. He turned away. Margaret stood there for a second, then followed. The ground was not as she had imagined. There was no order or cleanliness. The seats were not neatly arranged. There was only the roar of engines, the pungent smell of fuel and suitcases weighing dozens of pounds rolling on the conveyor belt. Frank stopped in front of a trailer. Load, he said, gesturing. Margaret looked at the suitcases. They're not luxury brands. No soft leather, just hard, scratch-resistant heavy plastic. She bent down and grasped the first one in her hand. Her back ached. Lift with your legs, a voice called from behind. Margaret returned. That was Tanya Brooks, a ground worker in her 40s with a sun-tanned complexion and sharp but not malicious eyes. Don't bend like that, Tanya Noi. You'll blow your back in a week. Margaret nodded and complied. The suitcase is still heavy. She gritted her teeth and pushed him into the car. Sweat trickled down my forehead, icy cold in the wind. Tanya looked at her for a moment. You're new, she said. Margaret nodded. Yeah, Tanya shrugged. Everyone is once. No mockery, no curiosity. It's just a blunt statement. Margaret worked in silence, one suitcase after another. Every time she bent down, it felt like her back was being pulled and jolted. Every time she stood up, she had to take a deep breath. Old images began to creep into Margaret's mind. Gate F-12. The lights are on. Her voice rings out through the microphone. Zone 1 boarding. She used to think of it as power. Now power is simply having enough strength to lift one more suitcase. On the other side of the world, Naomi Carter is sitting in compartment 1A. The electronic window rolled down, revealing swirling white clouds below. She took off her shoes and placed her feet on the soft carpet. A new flight attendant, Lena Morales, placed a glass of water in front of her. "Anything else I can get you, Miss Carter, Lena Hoy?" Naomi smiled. "Just water is fine, Konoi." "And please, Naomi." Lena nodded. "Of course." As Lena turned away, Naomi leaned back in her chair. She closed her eyes, not for sleeping, but for listening. Listen to the steady sound of the engine. Listen to your own breathing. She thought about Margaret, not with a sense of schadenfreude, but with a very specific, heavy burden. Naomi knew her decision wasn't the end. It's just the beginning of a difficult road, and that path is not for those who are not ready to confront themselves. On the ground, Margaret began to tremble. "It's not because of the cold, but because I'm tired." Frank looked at his watch. "Break," he said. 10 minutes. Margaret sat down on the concrete steps. Her hands trembled as she took off her gloves. The finger is swollen and red. The skin is cracked. Tanya sat down next to her. "First day's the worst," Tanya said. Margaret chuckled softly. "Is it?" she asked. Tanya nodded. "Your body learns konoi. Your pride takes longer." Margaret bowed her head. "Yeah," she whispered. A moment of silence fell. Tanya looked at her, then continued. "You worked inside before, right?" Margaret nodded. "Gate." Tanya whistled softly. "That's a long fall," she said. "No offense." Margaret shook her head. "None taken," she replied. She looked at her grease-stained safety shoes. "Do you ever—" she began, then stopped. "Ask Kwei Sang." "Ever," what Margaret took a deep breath. "Do you ever feel invisible, Bahoy?" Tanya smiled, an unhappy smile. "Every day, Konoi. But you get used to it." Margaret closed her eyes. That remark pierced her deeper than any reproach. Up high, Naomi opened her laptop. A new email appeared. Subject initial report. Gate F-12 incident. She reads slowly. No editing, no additions, read only. Then she closed the machine. Naomi knew this report would be used in meetings, in training, in policy decisions. But what concerned her more was what wasn't in the report. Evan's reaction as he stood up, Janice's look of remorse, and Margaret's silence before her final words. Those things cannot be recorded in writing. They only exist in humans. On the ground, Frank blew his whistle. Back to work. Margaret stood up. This time, she lifted the suitcase in the correct position. "It's still serious, but I'm not panicking." With each movement, she did it more slowly, more carefully. Tanya looked at her and nodded slightly. "Good," she said. Margaret did not answer. "She focuses on the immediate task at hand." As the sun rose higher, sweat drenched my shirt. Her back ached intensely. But something strange happened. She no longer thought about the people who were watching her. No longer thinking about loss. She was only thinking about the next suitcase. And then there's the next one. One job, clear, no ambiguity. Up high, Naomi opened the window and looked outside. The sun shone through the clouds, its light stretching like an endless road. She recalled her own words. She will have to start learning from scratch again. Naomi knew that sounded cruel, but she also knew it was the only way not to destroy a person, but to force them to rebuild. As the plane landed, Naomi prepared to stand up. Lena returned. "Welcome to London, Naomi," she said. Naomi smiled. "Thank you," she replied. She walked off the plane without looking back. Elsewhere on the Atlanta ground, Margaret Whitmore bent down to pick up the last suitcase of the shift. Back pain, numb hands. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was standing above anyone. It's simply about standing on your own 2 feet. And that, though it hurts, it's true. Naomi Carter had just stepped out of Heathrow Customs when her phone in her pocket rang for the 3rd time. She stopped in the middle of the crowded street. Her rolling suitcase glided across the polished stone pavement. The screen lit up. 37 missed calls, 142 text messages, 8 urgent emails. Naomi closed her eyes for a second. She knew this would happen. She just didn't expect it to happen so quickly. Across the ocean in Atlanta, a video less than 2 minutes long is spreading at breakneck speed. There's no official title, just a hastily typed line: "Flight attendant humiliates black CEO at gate." She didn't know. The video quality is not high. The image is slightly shaky. The sound is mixed with airport noise. But it's clear enough to see Margaret Whitmore stood at the counter. Her voice was harsh, her gaze cold. And Naomi Carter stood silently, phone in hand. There's no ending. There's no scene of Naomi being invited onto the plane. There's no transfer decision. There was only a moment of confrontation. And the internet loves that moment. In London, Naomi got into the car. The driver asked, "Hotel, miss?" Carter Naomi nodded. "Yes, please." The car started moving. She opened her phone. The first hashtag that caught her eye was number Gate F12. Next is number Flying While Black, number Know Your Place, number Aurelius Air. Naomi glided slowly. Not out of curiosity, but out of responsibility. She read the first comments. Another Karen exposed. "Fire her immediately. Drag her." Those words were as sharp as knives. Naomi exhaled. Then she saw other comments. "Why didn't the CEO speak up sooner? She could have ended it immediately. Why let it go that far?" Naomi stopped. That's the other side of public opinion. It's not just anger. There are demands. It demands that the victim react the right way. They must be stronger. They must be more perfect. She locked the screen. In Atlanta, Margaret Whitmore was sitting in the small break room of the ramp. The shift has just ended. She opened the cupboard and took out a bottle of water. Tanya Brooks walked in. "Hey," she said. "Are you okay?" Margaret nodded. "I think so." Tanya sat down. "Your phone's been blowing up, Konoi. People outside are talking." Margaret looked at Tanya. "About what?" she asked. Tanya hesitated. "About you, Konoi, and the gate thing." Margaret felt her stomach clench. Tanya opened her phone and showed it to her grandmother. The video appeared. Margaret saw herself on the screen. Her voice was cold, sharp. "You don't belong here." Margaret raised her hand to her mouth. A feeling of nausea welled up. "That's me," she whispered. Tanya nodded. "Yeah." Margaret glided down. Thousands of comments. Disgusting. Racist. She should never work again. Margaret put the phone down on the table. Her hands trembled. Tanya said nothing. She just sat there. After a moment, Margaret spoke. "I didn't know she was a CEO Banoi." Tanya looked at her. "Does that change anything, Kohoi?" Margaret did not answer, because she knows the answer. In London, Naomi entered her hotel room. She put the bag down. She pulled the curtain. Gray light streamed in. The phone vibrates. The call came from the board chair of Aurelius Air. Naomi picked up the phone. "Yes," she said. The man's voice on the other end of the line was calm but tense. "This is escalating, Ong Noi. The board wants to know how you want to handle public response." Naomi leaned against the window. "How are they suggesting?" she asked. "Statement Ong Dap. Immediate. Condemn the behavior. Reassure the public." Naomi closed her eyes. A press release. A few well-chosen words. Everything will calm down. She has done this hundreds of times. But this time, she felt it wasn't enough. "And Margaret Naomi Hoy." The man was silent for a moment. "She's already been reassigned Ong Noi, but people want blood." Naomi opened her eyes. "People always do," she replied. A moment of silence. "Naomi," he said, "you don't have to carry this alone." Naomi looked outside. "I know, Konoi, but I will speak." The man paused. "Live?" he asked. "Yes," Naomi Dapp. "Not a statement. A conversation." In Atlanta, Margaret stood in front of the mirror in the dressing room. Her face looked more haggard in just one day. She took off her reflective vest. She looked at her hands. Small scratches, patches of peeling skin. The phone vibrates. A message from an unknown number. "You ruined my flight." Margaret locked her screen. Then there was other news. "I hope you lose everything." Margaret sat down on the bench. She recalled Naomi's words. "If you leave here right now, you'll take the story with you and tell it however you want." She didn't leave, but the story had left her. In London, Naomi turned on her computer. She turned on the camera. A small light switched on. Before pressing go live, she paused. She thought about Evan, about Janice, about Tanya, and Margaret too. She can't control the internet, but she can control her voice. Naomi pressed the button. The screen lit up. Thousands of people joined in just a few seconds. Naomi looked directly into the camera. Her voice was low, slow, clear. "Hello," she said. "My name is Naomi Carter." She paused for a moment. "I want to talk about a moment that many of us have experienced. View count is increasing rapidly." Naomi continued. "That's the moment when you're looked at, judged, and decided upon based solely on your appearance. No blaming, No naming names, only the truth. What happened at Gate F12 wasn't about one bad person, Naomi said. It was about a system that allows moments like that to happen without anyone speaking up. Comments scroll quickly. Naomi doesn't read. And I also want to say this, she continued. Justice isn't always about immediate punishment. She took a deep breath. Sometimes it's about someone staying, seeing the consequences and changing. In Atlanta, Margaret answered the phone. The live stream appeared. She listened to Naomi. No anger, no condemnation. It was just a voice that didn't abandon her but didn't offer any protection either. Margaret burst into tears. It was silent. Naomi finished in London. Thank you for listening, she said. Let's do better. Together. She turned off the camera. The room became quiet again. Naomi sat down in the chair. Her shoulders slumped. It wasn't because of physical exhaustion. It was because of the burden of leading the way. In Atlanta, Margaret stood up. Tomorrow she'll be back at the ramp. No one applauded. No one publicly forgave. But she knew she was in the middle of a process that couldn't be fast-forwarded. And somewhere between the noise of the internet and the silence of the earth, a story is being written. Not because of the crowd, but it's because these people are forced to live with the consequences. 3 months have passed. The internet has found a new story. Another scandal. Another face to outrage. The hashtag number GateF12 no longer appears on the front page. Old videos are buried under millions of new clips. But for those who were there that day, time didn't fly by so quickly. In Atlanta, autumn arrives quietly. Early in the morning, a thin mist covered the runway. The air was cool, carrying the smell of metal and fuel. Margaret Whitmore pulled up her reflective collar and stepped out into the ramp. Her back still ached, not as intensely as the first week, but a dull ache. Frank Delgado stood near the trailer, marking the assignment board. Whitmore, he called. Gate C7, narrow body. Margaret nodded. Got it. No one looked at her again. No one whispered. No one pointed. She had become part of the scene. Tanya Brooks walked by and gave her a new pair of gloves. Yours were tearing Tanya Noy. Margaret took it. Thanks. The two of them work in parallel. No need for many words, but we're not far apart anymore. Margaret learned the rhythm of the ground, when to duck, when to push, when to stop to avoid the wheels. Her body changed, slow, painful, but real. There were days when Margaret came home in silence. Don't turn on the TV. Don't read the news. She cooked a simple dinner, washed the dishes, sighted down in a chair, and think. It's not about Gate F12. It's not about Naomi Carter. But it's about the smaller moments. There were times she avoided eye contact. There were seemingly harmless remarks. You don't belong here. Now, standing in the cold wind, dressed just like everyone else, Margaret understood how hurtful that statement was. In New York, Naomi Carter stepped out of the elevator and entered a conference room on the 38th floor. The transparent glass panel offers a view down of the city transforming in winter. A thick report lay on the table. Workplace Culture Review. Aurelius Air. Naomi sat down. The senior leaders were waiting. No one is joking. No one is beating around the bush. One person spoke up. Since the Gate F12 incident, we've seen an increase in internal reports. Naomi nodded. Good, she said. Another person continued. Some staff feel uncomfortable speaking up. Naomi looked straight ahead. They always have konoi. They're just naming it now. No one objected. Naomi turned to the next page. Training, she said. Not a video, not a memo. She stopped. People don't learn empathy from slides. A council member asked, What are you suggesting? Naomi leaned back. I want stories, konoi. From inside. From people who've been on both sides of power. The room was silent. One person slowly asked, Are you thinking? Margaret Whitmore. Naomi didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window. 3 months. 3 months of no contact, no monitoring, no interference. Naomi returned. Not yet, she said, but maybe someday. In Atlanta, it was a rainy afternoon. Margaret took shelter under a canopy near the ramp. The rain was falling steadily. It pattered on the metal. Tanya stood next to her. Ever think you'd end up here, Tanya Hoy? Margaret shook her head. No. Tanya chuckled softly. Life's funny, she said. Margaret watched the rain. Not funny, she replied. Just honest. Tanya looked at her for a moment. You've changed, she said. Margaret shrugged. I had to banoi. Or I wouldn't survive this. Tanya nodded. Most people don't, she said. A moment of silence. Margaret Quay sang Tanya. Why did you help me Bahoy? Tanya thought for a moment. Because I've seen people fall konoi. Most of them land hard and turn bitter. She looked at Margaret. You didn't! Margaret swallowed hard. I wanted to, she whispered. Some days. Tanya placed her hand on the railing. But you didn't, she repeated. In New York, Naomi stands in front of a whiteboard in her office. Above it were the words written in handwriting, Power, Silence, Systems, Choice. She circled the last word. Choice. The phone vibrates. Message from Evan Brooks. Miss Carter, I just wanted to say thank you. I got promoted to lead attendant today. Naomi smiled. She typed it back. Congratulations, Evan. Use your voice well. She put the phone down. An idea gradually formed in her mind. It's not about policy. It's not about reporting. But it's about people. In Atlanta, Margaret returned home. She opened the mailbox. A thick envelope. Logo Aurelius Air. Corporate. Margaret stood still for a long time before opening it. Inside was a letter. Not long. Not flowery. Just one line, Miss Whitmore. Please contact corporate HR regarding a potential role. This is not disciplinary. Margaret sat down on the steps. Her heart was beating fast. Not because of hope, but because of fear. Afraid of returning to the old world, afraid of power returning before she's ready. In New York, Naomi signed a document. The last line. Pilot Program Empathy and Accountability Training. She put down her pen. Expiratory. She doesn't know if this program will change the entire system, but she knew one thing. Doing nothing is the most dangerous option. In Atlanta, Margaret was holding a phone. Her fingers trembled. She dialed the number. Hello, Banoy. This is Margaret Whitmore. I received your letter. A female voice on the other end of the line replied, Yes, Miss Whitmore. Thank you for calling. We'd like to invite you to a conversation. Margaret closed her eyes. Not because of fear, but because of the weight of opportunity. In New York, Naomi stood in front of a mirror. She looked into her eyes, not to seek certainty, but to remind myself power doesn't end with difficult decisions. It begins with long-term responsibility. In Atlanta, Margaret stood up. Outside, the rain has stopped. The sky was gray but brighter. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Not glorious, not fast. But for the first time, she didn't try to return to a higher position. She just wanted to be more deserving. And somewhere between New York and Atlanta, between those who were once looked down upon and those who once looked down, a bridge is being built. Not with a loud apology. But it takes time and choices each day. The meeting room on the 22nd floor of Aurelius Air headquarters was brighter than Margaret Whitmore had imagined. The winter sunlight streamed through the large windows, reflecting off the long, polished wooden table. Margaret stood in the doorway, her hand gripping the strap of her bag. She had replaced her ramp uniform with a simple gray jacket. No makeup, no badges. She was just a middle-aged woman trying to keep her breathing steady. Miss Whitmore. The assistant's voice rang out. Margaret nodded. Please come in, the girl said. Margaret walked in. There were 4 people in the room, 2 people from HR. One is a senior manager at Aurelius Air. And Naomi Carter. Naomi stood by the window. No power suit, just a dark sweater holding a cup of coffee. Margaret stopped. Her heart was pounding. 3 months! 3 months have passed since Gate F-12. She had prepared for this meeting, in her mind, during sleepless nights, during mornings when her back ached so much she couldn't bend over. But no preparation is the same as actually seeing that person in front of you, Naomi returned. Her eyes met Margaret's, not cold, not harsh, just a calm glance. Good morning, Naomi said. Margaret opened her mouth. Good morning, she replied. No one was in a hurry to sit down. The air in the room grew thicker. The manager cleared his throat. Thank you for coming, Miss Whitmore Ong Noi. This meeting is part of our new internal initiative. Margaret nodded, but her eyes never left Naomi. Naomi put the glass down, pulled up a chair, and sat down. Margaret sat down as well. HR opened the file. Miss Whitmore Ngui Fu Nu Noi, your reassignment has been reviewed. Your performance on the ramp has been consistent. Margaret didn't know whether to laugh or to bow her head. However, HR TPEP, we're exploring a pilot program focused on empathy, conflict, and accountability. The manager turned to Naomi. Naomi will explain. Naomi nodded. Margaret, she said, her voice slow. I didn't invite you here to re-examine the past. Margaret swallowed hard. Naomi continued. I invited you because you have been on both sides of the power spectrum. The room was silent. Margaret took a deep breath. Miss Carter, Banoy, if this is about an apology. Naomi raised her hand slightly. No, she said. Not today. Margaret froze. Naomi leaned forward. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want an honest answer. Margaret nodded. Naomi looked straight ahead. That day at Gate F12, what did you think when you saw me? The question fell onto the table like a heavy object. HR and management looked at each other, but no one interrupted. Margaret felt a lump in her throat. She had asked herself this question hundreds of times. But I never dared to answer aloud. Honestly, she asked. Naomi nodded. Margaret looked down at her hands. I think she doesn't belong there, she said softly. No defenses. No beating around the bush. I think she'll disrupt things, slow everything down, and I think I have the right to stop that. After saying that, Margaret closed her eyes, as if ready for a strike. Naomi didn't react immediately. She allowed the silence to prevail. Then she asked another question. And then Margaret opened her eyes. Then she said, I thought if I didn't stop her, I would lose control. A pause. I'm not afraid of her, Margaret said. I'm afraid of feeling insignificant. No one in the room was breathing heavily. Naomi nodded slowly. Thank you, she said, for saying that. Margaret looked up. Miss Carter, she said, her voice trembling. I do not expect to be forgiven. Naomi looked at her. I'm not here to give, she replied. Just to decide. She turned to HR. This show, Naomi said, doesn't need a perfect speaker. HR nodded. Naomi returned to Margaret. It needs people who dare to admit where they went wrong. Margaret felt her heart pounding. She's not an example to be ridiculed, Naomi continued. She's an example to learn from. The manager leaned forward. Are you saying, he asked. Naomi nodded. I want Margaret to be involved in the program, she said. Not as a leader, not as an advisor. Margaret held her breath. As a storyteller, Naomi said, the one who stands before the new employee and says, this is how I did it wrong, and this is the price I pay. The room fell silent. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. Not because of embarrassment, because they are recognized for their rightful place. I'm not sure I'm good enough, she said. Naomi smiled slightly. None of us are good enough, she said. We're just good enough. HR records, quick notes. The manager sighed. This would be unconventional, he said. Naomi looked at him. Change always is, she replied. Another moment of silence. HR closed the file. We'll proceed with a trial, the woman said. 6 weeks. Margaret looked up. 6 weeks, she asked. Naomi nodded. 6 weeks, she said. If you can't bear it, you can stop. Margaret thought of the ground, of the cold wind, of the heavy suitcases. Then she nodded. I'll do it, she said. Naomi stood up. Good, she said. The meeting ended quickly. HR and management leave the room. Only Naomi and Margaret remained. The door closed. The silence was different this time. Not tense, not heavy. Just 2 women standing at opposite ends of a bridge. Margaret, Naomi said. Margaret returned. I want you to understand one thing, Naomi said. This decision doesn't erase what has already happened. Margaret nodded. I know, she replied. Naomi continued. But it gives her a chance to do something useful with her own mistakes. Margaret took a deep breath. Miss Carter, she said. Why me? Naomi thought for a second. Because she stayed, she said. Because she didn't run away. And because she endured the pain without blaming anyone. Margaret bowed her head. Thank you, she said. Not a thank you for victory, but a very human thank you. Naomi opened the door. She paused before stepping out. Margaret, she said. Yes, this isn't about atonement, Naomi said. This is about responsibility. Margaret nodded. I understand. Naomi left. Margaret stood there alone. The sunlight shone on the table. She placed her hand on the cold wooden surface. For the first time in years, Margaret wasn't thinking about what position she would return to. She was only thinking about the people who would be sitting in front of her. Young faces. Eyes that don't yet understand how little power can hurt others. Naomi walked slowly down the hallway outside. She stopped in front of the window, looking down at the runway in the distance. She doesn't know if this decision will be supported by public opinion. She didn't know how long the management would be patient. But she knew one thing. If the system doesn't learn from real cracks, it will repeat the same mistakes with other names. Naomi took a deep breath. She turned away, not with the feeling that everything is settled, but with the awareness that the real responsibility has only just begun. The training room on the 6th floor isn't very big. There was just enough space for about 40 neatly arranged chairs, a projection screen, and a low wooden platform at the front. No big logo. No spotlights. Everything looks normal. Margaret Whitmore stood behind the door, clutching a thin stack of papers in her hand. Inside, there was a low murmur of conversation. Young voices. Short bursts of laughter. New employee. They didn't know who she was. They only knew that today was a special session about communication and problem-solving. Margaret took a deep breath. Her back ached slightly. Not enough to stop. Just enough to remind her that she was here in her real body. Tanya Brooks stood beside him wearing a ground crew uniform. "You ready, Tanya Hoy?" Margaret swallowed hard. "I don't think so, Badap, but I'm going in anyway." Tanya smiled. That's usually how it starts. The door is open. Margaret walked in. The conversation in the room slowed down, then fell silent. Not out of respect, but out of curiosity. A training supervisor stood up. "Good morning, everyone, Antanoy. Today's session is a little different." He turned to Margaret. "This is Margaret Whitmore." Margaret stepped forward. There was no applause, just glances. Some people are looking at their phones. Some are leaning back. Some are crossing their arms. Margaret placed the stack of papers on the platform. Then, she didn't open it. She looked around the room. These are faces unfamiliar with power. They don't yet understand the value of a single word. Margaret took a deep breath. "My name is Margaret Whitmore," she said. Her voice was steady, but not loud either. "I worked for Aurelius Air for 22 years. A few people looked up. I used to stand at the gate. Ba-teep. I thought my job was to keep order." A pause. What I was really doing was deciding who mattered. Nobody laughed. Margaret looked down at the front row of seats. A young, dark-skinned girl is listening attentively. Margaret continued. "3 months ago, I told a passenger she didn't belong. Some people whispered." Margaret raised her hand. "You've probably seen the video, Banoy. I won't show it again." She paused. "Not because it's painful for me, Banoy, but because it's easy to judge from a screen." The air in the room grew thicker. Margaret placed both hands on the platform. "I want to tell you what you didn't see. One beat. You didn't see the confidence I felt, Banoy. When I said those words, a few people stirred. You didn't see how normal it felt, Margaret Tiep. How justified." She looked at each row of seats. "I wasn't angry. I wasn't yelling. I was calm." Margaret exhaled. "And that's the dangerous part." A gulping sound echoed from somewhere. Margaret continued. "I believed the uniform gave me authority. I believed seniority meant superiority." She paused. "I believed wrong." The room was completely silent. No one is looking at their phones anymore. Margaret told the story slowly, about Gate F-12, about Naomi Carter's gaze, about the moment the tickets were torn. No dramatization, no self-justification. It's just the naked truth. "I didn't lose my job that day, Margaret Noy. I lost my story." She looked down at her hands. "For the first time, I wasn't the one deciding how things went." One person raised their hand. Margaret nodded. "Can I ask something?" a young man asked. "Yes," Margaret replied. "Did you know she was a CEO co-hoy?" Margaret looked straight ahead. "No," she said. "And that's the point." The whole room fell silent. Margaret continued. "If I had known, I would have smiled. I would have apologized." She swallowed. "And that's exactly why it matters." The dark-skinned girl in the front row raised her hand. "Why didn't you just quit Kohoy?" "After everything." Margaret pondered. "Because quitting would have been easier, Banoy. And easy doesn't teach you anything." A few people nodded. Margaret looked around. "I worked on the ramp, Banoy, in the cold, with people I used to ignore." She smiled gently. "They taught me more about respect than my title ever did." A moment of silence. Margaret folded the papers. "I'm not here to tell you what to do, Banoy. I'm here to tell you what happens when you forget you're dealing with a person." The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioner. Margaret bowed slightly. That's all. There was no signal to end the game. No one stood up immediately. Then, a round of applause rang out. Slow, Isolated. Then another one. And then another. Not noisy, but complete. Margaret stood still. Don't bow your head. Don't smile broadly. Just stand there. After the talk, the training manager approached. That was powerful, he said. Margaret nodded. Thank you. A group of young employees approached. Miss Whitmore, one of the women said. I've never heard anyone admit that. Margaret replied. It's easier after you've lost everything you were protecting. At the far end of the room, Naomi Carter stood leaning against the wall. She didn't appear from the beginning. She wasn't introduced. Just listen. She watched Margaret talk to each person individually. No teaching, no classes, just reply. Naomi went outside first. The light is softer in the hallway. She paused, looking out the window. A difficult choice, a slow path. But it's true. Margaret stepped out from behind. Seeing Naomi, she stopped. I don't know what to say, Naomi returned. Thank you, she said. Margaret shook her head. No, she replied. Thank you for letting me stay. Naomi looked at her. This is only the beginning, she said. Margaret nodded. I know. The two stood next to each other for a while. No further explanation needed. Inside the training room, the chairs were empty, but the questions remained. And somewhere in each of those who heard, a small thought began to sprout. It's not about right or wrong in a grand sense. But the next time when faced with a stranger, will they choose silence or humanity? 3 weeks after the first training session, emails started appearing. No noise, no anger, but it's cold. The title should be concise and polite. Concerns regarding internal training initiative. Naomi Carter read that email in her New York office on a drizzly morning. She wasn't surprised. She had been waiting for this moment. The email came from a middle management team at Aurelius Air. Use careful language. Avoid attacks. But each line carries the same message. This program is going too far. Naomi set her coffee cup down. She flipped to the next email. Potential reputational risk. Then the third email. Staff morale impact. Naomi leaned back in her chair. She closed her eyes for a few seconds. It's not because I'm tired. It's because I'm used to it. Every real change comes with a moment when those who aren't ready begin to feel afraid. In Atlanta, Margaret Whitmore entered the training room for the 4th session of the pilot program. The room wasn't as crowded today as usual. There are a few empty seats. It's not about the shift. It's about choice. Margaret realized that immediately. The dark-skinned girl from the day before was still sitting in the front row. But some other faces had disappeared. Margaret didn't ask. She started as usual. No slides, no video. It's just the voice. But today she sensed something different. No need to stress. It's suspicion, not doubt. A young man stood with his arms crossed, leaning back, his gaze unwavering. Margaret recounted. About the ramp, about the cold, about the days when no one called her name. Then the man raised his hand. Can I be honest? He asked. Margaret nodded. Of course. He stood up. I don't see why we're still talking about this Hanoi. It was one incident. Why punish everyone? A few people nodded. Margaret was silent for a moment. Then she replied, I'm not here to punish anyone, Hanoi. I'm here because one incident is never one incident. He shrugged. But it feels like guilt training in Noi. Margaret looked at him. Only if you see yourself in it, Dop. The room fell silent. In New York, Naomi walked into the boardroom. The atmosphere is tense. One member spoke up immediately. We need to talk about the training, he said. Naomi nodded. Let's, she replied. Someone else chimed in. Some managers feel targeted motngui noi. They think the program implies systemic failure. Naomi tilted her head. Isn't it? She asked. Some people changed positions. The board chair spoke up. Naomi, he said slowly. The question is not whether you're right. Naomi looked at him. It's whether this is sustainable. Naomi exhaled. Sustainability without integrity, konoi is just delay. Another person chimed in. We're getting pushback, ongnoi, from investors. Naomi looked straight ahead. From which ones, she asked. The man hesitated. Those focused on short-term stability. Naomi nodded. Then this makes sense, konoi. Change always scares short-term thinking. The air in the room felt heavier. Board chair with backrest. Naomi, he said. If this continues, we may need to pause the program. Naomi didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the table. Evan's face appeared in her mind. Tanya's. Margaret's, those who had no choice when the system remained silent. Naomi looked up. "No," she said. The voice wasn't high-pitched. It wasn't shaky, just sure. The board chair frowned. "Excuse me," Naomi placed both hands on the table. "We don't pause accountability," she said. "We refine it." One member shook his head. "This could cost us," he said. Naomi looked at him. "So does doing nothing," she replied. A long silence followed. The board chair looked at Naomi for a long time. "Are you willing to stake your position on this Ong Hoi?" The question landed in the meeting room like a door slamming shut. Naomi didn't blink. "Yes," she said. Nobody said anything. Not because it was a surprise, because they understand what that means. In Atlanta, Margaret finished her training. There was no applause. Only a few people stayed. The dark-skinned girl walked over. "My dad worked ramp for 30 years, Konoi. He never talked about it." Margaret nodded. "That area rarely does," she said. "Thank you for saying it out loud," the girl said. Margaret smiled. When the room was empty, Margaret sat down in a chair. Her back hurt more than the day before, not for work, because of the weight of standing upright. Her phone rang. Message from HR. "Please be available tomorrow morning." Margaret closed her eyes. She knew what was coming. In New York, Naomi stood alone in her office. It's getting dark. The city was brightly lit. Her phone rang. Message from the board chair. "We'll continue for now, but pressure is increasing." Naomi didn't answer. She walked to the window. She thought about something few people understood. Leadership is not about making popular decisions. Rather, it's about standing strong when that decision leaves you alone. The following day, Margaret was summoned to the regional office. It's not a large meeting room. It's just a small room. "Manage the seating area opposite you." "Margaret," he said. "There are complaints." Margaret nodded. "I expected that," she replied. He looked at her. "You could step back, Ong Noi." "This doesn't have to be your fight," Margaret pondered. "Serba Noi, it became my fight the moment I stayed." He exhaled. "Naomi Carter is pushing hard," he said. Margaret nodded. "She always did," she said. The manager looked up. "You're aware this might not end well, Ong Hoi." Margaret looked at him. "I already lost what mattered most to me, Ba Dap. What's left is honesty." In New York, Naomi walked into a small press conference. No big announcement. Only a few reporters. She stood in front of the microphone. No long speeches. Just one sentence. "We're not perfect, Naomi Noi, but we're done pretending that's the same as being neutral." A reporter asked, "Are you afraid this will hurt your career?" Naomi looked straight ahead. "I'm afraid of what happens if I don't do it, Kodap." The news spread. Not as viral as Gate F12, but it's enough to clarify the line. In Atlanta, Margaret went home. She sat down at the kitchen table. Turn on the lights. Silent. There's no doubt about it. This path will not lead her back to a higher position. It only brought her closer to her true self. In New York, Naomi turned off the lights in her office. She picked up her coat. Before leaving, she turned back to look at the empty room. She doesn't know how long she'll remain in this position, but she knew she had chosen the right time not to back down. Somewhere between Atlanta and New York, the show continues. Not loud, not absolutely loved, but it's true. And sometimes that's all it takes to start a change. 12 months after Gate F12. No more hashtags. No more videos shared every hour. No more noisy online debates. The internet has moved forward. But some things don't disappear just because people stop talking about them. In Atlanta, one early spring morning, a thin layer of mist still clung to the car's windows. The air carried the damp scent of earth and fresh grass. Margaret Whitmore walked into the employee parking lot at 6:10 a.m. No more reflective vests, no more thick gloves. She was wearing a simple jacket and her new employee ID badge. Training and culture. Internal programs. Margaret paused for a second in front of the building's entrance. She had worked at this airport for over 20 years, but she had never entered through this entrance, not for career advancement, not for fame, simply because she has changed. Inside the training room, 20 chairs had already been arranged. Not a new employee today. It's about frontline management. The people standing at the counter, at the boarding gate, at places where a single word can ruin someone's entire day. Margaret put the bag down. She took a deep breath. Her back still ached. But now it was no longer a pain that made her feel ashamed. It was a reminder that she had come a long way. The door opened. the first people to enter. Some people looked at her, frowning slightly. Margaret recognized that look. She used to have it. She smiled gently, not to appease, but to accept. "Good morning," Margaret said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. In New York, Naomi Carter was standing in a different room. Not a meeting room, not a stage. It's just a small space in a community center in Brooklyn. About 30 folding chairs. On the wall were old photographs of small businesses owned by black people. Naomi wasn't on the stage. She sat among everyone. An elderly woman asked, "Do you ever get tired, always having to be the one in charge?" Naomi smiled. "Yes," she replied. "But I'm more tired knowing I could do something and choosing to remain silent." A young man asked, "Do you regret not handling Gate F-12 more quickly?" Naomi thought for a moment. "I regret that the system needed that moment to learn," she said. "But I don't regret letting people face the real consequences." There was no applause, just slow nods. In Atlanta, Margaret began her training. There is no first slide. She only said, "I'm not here to teach you how to speak more politely. I'm here to tell you what happens when we forget that the person in front of us is also carrying a life of their own." A middle-aged man stood with his arms crossed. "Why should we listen to you?" he asked directly. Margaret looked at him. "Because I was you, Badap, and I paid for it. There are no further challenges. Just silence." In New York, Naomi left the community center in the late afternoon. She walked a few blocks without a driver or assistant. She stopped in front of a small coffee shop. Inside, a young girl was working behind the counter. The girl looked up. "Hi, what can I get you?" Naomi looked at her. Not for seeking power, not for judging. It was just an ordinary moment. "Black coffee, please, Naomi Noy." The girl smiled. "Coming right up." Naomi received the cup of coffee. "Thank you," she said. The girl replied, "Have a good day." Naomi stepped outside. She knew it was in small moments like these that things truly changed. In Atlanta, the training session concluded. No one applauded loudly, but some people lingered. A woman approached. "My brother was denied boarding once, Konoy. He never talked about it again." Margaret nodded. "Many don't ba Noi. That's why we have to." When the room was empty, Margaret sat down in a chair. She opened her phone. A new message. From Naomi Carter. "I heard today went well." Margaret smiled. She typed it back. It was quiet. "That's how I know it mattered." In New York, Naomi read the messages. She put the phone down. Look out the window. The city is still noisy, still bustling. But somewhere in that system, the small gears have been shifting. No one is completely saved. No one becomes a hero. Only those who choose not to revert to being their old selves. A year after Gate F-12, Aurelius Air is no better than other airlines. There are still complaints. There are still mistakes. But there's something else. Stories are told sooner. Eyes meet more directly. I'm sorry's come at the right time. And sometimes that's all a system can do to begin healing. Margaret Whitmore did not return to being a gatekeeper. She became the one who opened the door to the truth. Naomi Carter didn't become a perfect icon. She simply continued to choose to stand with people when it wasn't easy. And if there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this. You don't need great power to hurt someone, but you always need great humanity to avoid doing that. If you've been with this story from Gate F-12 until the very last moment, thank you for listening. If this story makes you think, please like this video. If you know someone who has been on both sides of power, share this with them. And if you believe that slow, deep, and very human stories still have a place on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next journeys. We will meet again.